I've collected amazing historical photos that you've hardly seen before. Subscribe. I post such collections every day. A sign at Bergen-Belsen marks mass grave number 5, sealed on April 23, 1945. Across 14 graves, the memorial holds at least 23,200 people. Black September guards Israeli athletes inside the Olympic Village during the Munich Olympics in 1972. The Munich crisis reshaped global event security, pushing the Olympics toward far tighter protection in the years that followed. United States agents take Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega into custody after the United States invasion of Panama in 1989. He surrendered on January 3, 1990, after 10 days inside the Vatican diplomatic mission. Lieutenant Alva D. Hennahan stands by his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt after an 88mm shell blasted a man-sized hole through the wing. A 1955 BMW Isetta slides into a custom caravan like a tiny car garage on wheels. This setup let owners tow a full microcar for city trips while keeping it clean, locked, and out of the weather. Brighton Swimming Club members pose in top hats and swim trunks on the beach in 1863. Early swim groups like this helped turn seaside bathing from a wild dare into a real organized sport. A woman log driver in New Hampshire balances on floating timber and steers it with a long pike pole around 1938 to 1945. One slip could jam the whole drive, so skilled drivers kept the logs moving fast from forest to mill. In the 1987 to 1988 season, the Washington Bullets had Manute Bol at 7 feet 7 inches and Muggsy Bogues at 5 feet 3 inches on the same roster. That is a 2 feet 4 inches gap. Copper miners picket a company store in Ducktown, Tennessee in September 1939, posting signs to shame strikebreakers. The SO dealer sign and the waiting car turned this curb into a daily showdown over who controlled the town's wages and food. A woman plugs in an electric car in 1912 using a cable like a modern charging session. In that era, many city drivers chose electric cars because they were quiet, clean, and did not need hand cranking. A street sign in Sarajevo reads, "Beware Sniper," during the 1,425-day siege, ending in 1996. Locals called this stretch Sniper Alley because crossing the open road could turn into a sudden life or death sprint. Fred Rogers works behind the scenes on the neighborhood of Make-Believe, set for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, photographed sometime between 1984 and 2000. He voiced and moved many of the puppets himself. Adolf Hitler walks past uniformed supporters giving a salute, a moment staged for power and loyalty. Historians record at least 42 plots aimed at stopping him, including an early street clash in 1921. Souvenir hunters on Iwo Jima saw the propeller off a wrecked Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar in March 1945. They said the metal would become paperweights, turning a crashed fighter into desk souvenirs. Mount St. Helens before and after the 1980 eruption, when the summit was torn away and a wide crater replaced it. The blast dropped the peak by about 1,300 feet and left the volcano still venting from its new open scar. Marilyn Monroe smiles backstage while the script is reviewed for the Jack Benny program on December 4, 1953. That TV spot came during her breakout year, just months after Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire made her a global star. United States hostages step off a plane in January 1981, greeted by a sign that reads, "Welcome back to freedom." They were released on January 20, 1981, after 444 days in Iran. King Kong premiered in New York on March 2, 1933, turning a stop-motion monster into an overnight legend. Its effects and roar-shaped creature movies for decades, and that Empire State image became one of cinema's most copied shots. President Calvin Coolidge signs the Jones Act on March 2, 1929, raising penalties for breaking prohibition laws. The Jones Law pushed the maximum punishment up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Operation Rolling Thunder begins on March 2, 1965, with United States Air Force jets hitting an ammunition depot at Zombang, about 10 miles inside North Vietnam. The campaign grew into a years-long air war. A man sits wired to an early polygraph, a device first developed in 1921 to record pulse, breathing, and blood pressure during questioning. Its charts look scientific, but polygraph results are still disputed and often not accepted as proof in court. Andre the Giant, a French wrestler with acromegaly, stood over 213 centimeters tall and died in 1993. Reports say his body was flown to North Carolina for cremation because no crematorium in France could handle his size. A winter swimmer in Leningrad stands on drifting river ice in 1968, sunbathing in a swimsuit with the city skyline behind her. Walrus clubs made cold water dips a serious hobby, and some swimmers trained all year to handle near-freezing water. Women window cleaners in London work high on ladders around 1917, part of the wartime shift as women filled jobs left by men in uniform. Their bucket and ladder crews became a common street sight during the First World War. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev shares a cigarette with Indonesian President Sukarno during a visit in 1960. It captures Indonesia's Cold War balancing act, courting both Moscow and Washington while leading the non-aligned movement. A French soldier stands guard in the Kasbah of Algiers in 1960 while a barber keeps cutting hair on the sidewalk. The ordinary shave beside a ready rifle shows how daily life continued inside the Algerian War. An Irish teenager shouts at British soldiers during the Northern Ireland Troubles, inches from a rifle aimed down the street. The photo freezes the raw tension of a place where a single corner could feel like a front line. People crowd around Rafael Trujillo's Chevrolet after the May 30, 1961 roadside attack outside Ciudad Trujillo. He had ruled the Dominican Republic since 1930 and even renamed the capital for himself. Stilt-walking shepherds in rural France stand above the grasslands in the early 1900s, using long wooden stilts and poles to move fast and see farther. In the Landes region, this skill became everyday transport. Apollo 9 crew walked to the pad van at Kennedy Space Center on March 3, 1969. It was one of 5 crewed Apollo launches packed into 7 months before Apollo 11. A First World War-era plane lies wrecked on a Paris street corner in 1917 at Rue de l'Acia and Furtado Hain. One wrong turn in early aviation could drop a whole aircraft into everyday city life. A man inspects the propulsion unit of a German V-2 rocket in East London in March 1945. V-2 strikes were the first long-range ballistic missile attacks, arriving with no warning before the sound. A 4-man human tower at Muscle Beach in the late 1940s, with fitness star Jack LaLanne second from the top. The base is Harold Zinkin, who later created the Universal Gym Machine, and they reportedly trained 2 years to nail this stunt. Men row a boat down a flooded Main Street in Massachusetts in 1937, passing storefront signs half underwater. The March 1937 floods swamped much of New England after heavy rain hit melting snow. A fake Luftwaffe plane is staged in a city street for an air raid precautions drill on February 24, 1940. The exercise in Portsmouth, Gosport, and Southampton used soldiers as mock casualties to rehearse how a real crash scene would be handled. 2 Cheka officers pose in leather coats beside one of the earliest Lenin monuments in the Soviet Union, photographed in 1924. The carving is set directly into a boulder. A sailor hands a camera up to a photographer perched on a Royal Navy aircraft at RNAS Stretton on March 4, 1943. Even in wartime, crews staged careful photos to document flights, damage, and daily life on the airfield. 6-year-old Patrick Power spars with Muhammad Ali in London on June 6, 1963, while Ali trains for Henry Cooper. Ali gave the boy tips and let him win a round, and the photos turned into a famous before the legend moment. Technicians in silver suits inspect the scorched Apollo 11 command module after Earth re-entry, photographed on August 14, 1969. An 1860s tooth puller used a small screw to grip the tooth before it was lifted out with the root. It comes from the era before modern numbing was common, when dentistry could feel like pure endurance. Ruptured ground after the Alaska earthquake of 1964, measured at magnitude 9.2. It remains the strongest recorded in North America and triggered tsunamis that reached far beyond Alaska. 9-year-old Rosemary Muller from Long Island watches a live televised heart operation while recovering from her own surgery in 1966. Medical broadcasts like this were early experiments in teaching and public outreach, long before online video made it normal. A British soldier returns home in 1945, smiling as he holds his 8-month-old daughter on the dock. After years overseas, reunions like this turned crowded piers into the first family photos of peace. RAF Ground Crew Wheel, Mark 11 aerial torpedoes toward a Bristol Beaufort of No. 22 Squadron at North Coats. The same aircraft, L-4516, crashed after a night takeoff, and the mine it carried detonated. A Panther tank Glacis is shattered by a British 17-pounder hit, cracking instead of denting. High hardness and low toughness in some wartime plates made impacts spread fractures like glass. A San Francisco fire crew tests a new wheeled extension ladder in 1921, stretched to its full height. These rigs could reach about 65 to 85 feet, built for the city's taller buildings. A London cosmetician paints stockings onto a client's legs during wartime rationing in 1941. The illusion often included a drawn seam line, making bare legs look like real hosiery from a distance. People watch Kilauea erupt at Halemaumau on May 22, 1924, with ash towering over the caldera. That month brought more than 50 blasts over about 2.5 weeks, and the famous lava lake disappeared until 2008. Women crowd behind jail bars in a United States police station in 1931 during the Great Depression. With jobs and money gone for millions, even small shoplifting cases surged as survival got desperate. A robot typist is shown at an office equipment expo in Paris in October 1960. It was more showroom theater than true artificial intelligence, built to sell the future of automated offices. Workers bake and pack ice cream cones at Sanitary Ice Cream Cone Company in Oklahoma City in 1917. The photo notes 14-year-old John Myers boxing cones beside a 12-year-old already working full-time. Workers reinforced the Berlin Wall in 1967, turning a city street into a sealed border. Built in 1961 to stop the mass flight from east to west, it soon became the clearest symbol of the Cold War split. German troops mass at a rally in Nuremberg on November 9, 1935. A decade later, the same city hosted the first international trials of top Nazi leaders after the Second World War. Laotian guerrillas moved food supplies by elephant for North Vietnamese forces in 1971. The animals could haul heavy loads through jungle trails where trucks could not go. United States Army paratroopers of the 187th Regimental Combat Team dropped from C-119 transports near Sukchon and Suncheon on October 20th, 1950. About 4,000 landed in the drop zone, even without radar-style navigation support. Soviet soldiers posed by the giant Bamiyan Buddha niches in Afghanistan in 1986. The statues stood for about 1,500 years before being destroyed in 2001. Vietnam War River Patrol, 1964 to 1975, with soldiers riding low in a narrow boat. These waterways were vital supply routes, so control of canals and rivers shaped daily movement and survival. Paratroopers regroup after landing in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic during the Kiev Military District maneuvers of 1935. About 1,188 troops jumped, one of the first large mass airborne drops in the Soviet Army. Soviet soldiers cool off in a makeshift pool in the Jalalabad Oasis, Nangarhar Province, in 1985. The pool is an inflated military raft turned into a bath in the Afghan heat. Hue, Vietnam, in 1968, with street vendors moving through ruins after the Battle of Hue. The fighting dragged on for weeks and left much of the city badly damaged. British Union of Fascists members dig a trench across a farm road in Devon on November 30, 1933, to block bailiffs from seizing livestock for unpaid tithes. The group, founded by Oswald Mosley in 1932, was later banned in 1940. A British Matilda Mark II tank wears the Sunshield disguise kit in Helwan, Egypt in 1941, making it look like a truck. The fake panels and canvas were meant to hide armor from air scouts before a move or attack. German prisoners of war line up for lunch in a camp in France in 1944. Many were captured during the Allied advance after the Normandy landings. A massive United States munitions dump covers a captured atoll in the Marshall Islands in 1944. This stockpile shows the scale of Pacific logistics, moving tons of supplies across ocean distances to keep the campaign advancing. Fishermen with long spears catch salmon at Celilo Falls on the Columbia River around 1920 on the Oregon-Washington border. The famous falls and fishery disappeared under the Dalles Dam Reservoir in 1957. The French liner Normandy lies on its side in New York in 1942, propellers lifted above the water after a pier fire during conversion into USS Lafayette. Firefighting water built a fatal list, and by February 10th, the ship rolled over. A group of KGB 7th Directorate officers pose in plain clothes beside their cars in the late 1980s. This unit handled close protection and surveillance work, and the casual look hides how tightly controlled their routines were. A Citroen lies flipped in a Paris street during the May 1968 strikes and protests. That month's unrest grew into the biggest general strike in French history, with millions walking off the job. The Motherland Call statue rises on scaffolding in Volgograd in the 1960s, built as the central memorial to the Battle of Stalingrad. At about 85 meters tall, it was engineered without external supports, making it one of the world's tallest statues of its time. Robert Wadlow stands beside his father in 1938, towering as the tallest person ever recorded. His height reached about 8 feet 11 inches and was caused by an overactive pituitary gland. General George Patton was injured in a car crash with a United States Army truck near Mannheim, Germany, on December 9, 1945. He died on December 21, 1945, a sudden end after years of frontline commands. A Cold War couple poses in clear protective suits on a city rooftop holding an emergency life pack for 8 days. The kit was marketed for nuclear fallout fears, turning survival planning into a consumer product. Women assemble electrical parts by hand on a factory line in the early 20th century, long before widespread automation. Mass production depended on thousands of small, fast motions repeated all day. Parker High School students in 1949 stage a hem-cutting stunt, trimming a girl's long skirt during a hallway protest over dress rules. It captures how teen fashion wars could turn into public theater long before social media. Nelson Mandela walks out to cheering crowds after his release on February 11, 1990. He had spent 27 years in prison, and his freedom opened the final road toward ending apartheid. Woodstock fans slide down a mud-soaked hill in 1969 as the crowd watches and laughs. After days of heavy rain, the festival field turned into a giant mud park and became part of the legend. Stuntman Bobby Leach posed with his Niagara Falls barrel feat in the 1920s after surviving the plunge. He later died from an infection after a simple slip and leg injury, a cruel twist after the big stunt. The Dynasphere single-wheel car rolls in 1932 with the driver sitting inside the giant ring. It reportedly reached about 30 miles per hour, but steering and braking were so awkward that it never caught on. Hugo Gernsback poses in The Isolator in 1925, a helmet meant to block sound and sight for focused writing. It used a small window and an oxygen feed, turning work into something that looks like science fiction. John Young and Michael Collins test the Gemini 10 capsule inside a 30-foot altitude chamber before launch. These chamber runs simulated near vacuum conditions to prove the suit and cabin systems would keep them alive. Kawasaki Key. 100 fighters seen from below in Japan in 1945 with the round wing marks clear. Built by fitting a radial engine to the Ki 61 airframe, it became one of Japan's best-turning fighters late in World War II. In 1945, United States General Douglas MacArthur met Japan's Emperor Hirohito in Tokyo days after the surrender. In the 1950s, Iran's Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi lights a cigarette for Queen Soraya. Soraya became empress in 1951, and the marriage ended in 1958 after they had no heir. A woman in the Azores wears the capote e capello, a cloak with a giant hood that hides the face and shapes a strange silhouette. On Fayal, this look stayed common until the 1930s, when modern coats replaced it. French Sherman tank Jourdan poses with civilians in Liévance, Haute-Saône in September 1944, a rare calm moment after liberation. Weeks later, near Raymondvillers, a Panzerfaust hit killed the driver Henri Forel and assistant driver Serge Fritsch. Two teenage champion pea-pickers pose at a contractor camp in Canyon County, Idaho in 1941 with their harvest hampers. They traveled camp to camp and could fill up to 32 hampers in a day at 30 cents each. President Lyndon Johnson leans in on Senator Richard Russell during the Civil Rights Act fight in 1964. Russell led the long Senate filibuster, but the bill still passed that summer and became a turning point in United States law. Concorde lifts off from Toulouse on its first flight in 1969, with test pilot André Turcat at the controls. It was the first supersonic airliner built jointly by Britain and France. Swiss strongman Maurice Deriaz poses in painter Gustave Courtois' studio around 1914, surrounded by half-finished portraits and tall easels. A disabled M4 Sherman from Company C, 741st Tank Battalion, sits at a Leipzig intersection in 1945, smoke still rising. It shows how close-range street fighting stayed deadly even in the final weeks in Europe. German troops carry the coffin of a Royal Air Force airman for a full military burial on the occupied Channel Islands in 1943. Even under occupation, both sides sometimes kept old battlefield rituals for fallen aircrew. Two young sisters share a wooden rocker, one arm locked around the other, staring straight into the lens. Early studio cameras needed long, still poses, so this tight hold was a real trick to keep children from moving. Conrad Morgan was an SS investigating judge who pursued cases of corruption and illegal abuse inside the SS system during World War II. After the war, he argued his work only slowed the mass-killing machine, and he was never convicted. A United States soldier from the 2nd Infantry Division poses in occupied Germany on March 26, 1919, holding a Browning automatic rifle. The rank is debated because officers rarely carried a BAR. Captured Italian field and heavy guns lined the wall outside Fort Mega in southern Abyssinia in 1941 after South African forces took the position. This hall shows how fast Italy's East African front collapsed once the Allies pushed inland. Jewish children in a Brussels orphanage dress in playful costumes for a Purim party in 1947, including a sheet ghost and fake mustaches. Purim is the holiday where kids wear disguises and retell the Book of Esther story like a loud costume parade. The passenger liner Adriatic shows an early indoor swimming pool in 1907, tucked under a low ceiling like a hidden room at sea. This was one of the first ocean liners to offer a real onboard pool, turning long crossings into luxury travel. A German brewery chimney rises over Tsingtao in 1903 during the city's German colonial era. This early plant later became the famous Tsingtao Brewery, still selling beer worldwide today. Boxer Jack Johnson sits at a farewell dinner in Sydney in 1907, hosted by the Colored Progressive Association. 2 years later, he became the first black world heavyweight champion, making him one of the most famous athletes on Earth. Boer fighters pose with rifles and bandoliers during the Siege of Ladysmith in 1899 to 1900. The siege lasted 118 days and ended when British relief forces finally broke through. Charlene Hunter arrives for her first day at the newly integrated University of Georgia on January 20th, 1961, as reporters crowd in. She and Hamilton Holmes were the first black students admitted there, a landmark moment in the civil rights era. A hooded detainee stands with arms outstretched at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in 2003. The photo became one of the most infamous images of the Iraq War and sparked worldwide outrage and investigations. A man wades through floodwater near Elbląg, Poland on January 21, 1983, carrying his dog on his back. The water is near chest height, turning a normal street into a freezing river. Haganah soldiers escort detained Palestinians after the village of Tantura surrendered on May 23, 1948. The event remains disputed, with later claims of a large number of civilian deaths and a possible burial site near today's Dore Beach. Frank Sinatra sits in his Ford Thunderbird at home in 1955, the clean lines and spare tire hump showing off the new American sports style. The Thunderbird debuted that year as Ford's two-seat answer to the Corvette, built for glamour more than racing. A pilot looks down to read "Goodbye," spelled in stones in the MASH finale, "Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen" in 1983. The episode drew about 105 million viewers in the United States, one of the biggest television audiences ever. Princess Diana steps past photographers in her black polka-dot Gina Frattini dress, a look she wore repeatedly in the early 1980s. Re-wearing the same designer dress was a quiet break from royal fashion rules and made her feel more modern and relatable. Tourists crowd a Grand Canyon lookout in 1919, with only thin rails between them and the drop. That same year, an act of Congress made it a national park, protecting over 1 million acres. Tenor saxophonist Eddie Lockjaw Davis plays with eyes closed, born in New York City on March 2, 1922. His hard-swinging sound powered bands led by Louis Armstrong and Count Basie, and later his own groups. Freddie the Freeloader meets Herman Munster on The Red Skelton Show in 1965, pairing a silent tramp clown with the famous TV monster. Red Skelton was known for clean primetime comedy, and this crossover moment still feels like two worlds colliding. Warsaw in October 1948, a sea of rubble with a church tower still standing, photographed by Robert Capa. The city had been reduced to ruins during World War II, then rebuilt street by street from this debris. Chicago messenger boys flood the street during a strike in 1902, grinning as they show their papers. These kids often worked long shifts delivering messages across the city for small pay, and the walkout forced adults to notice. The Temple of Music interior is shown with an X, marking the exact spot where President William McKinley was shot at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901. The photographer wrote the mark onto the image. People gather outside Medgar Evers's home in Jackson, Mississippi on June 12, 1963, moments after he was shot in his own driveway. His death became a major turning point for the civil rights movement. A New York businessman stands with his two young sons beside the First Lady inside the White House in the mid-1990s. 2 decades later, those same circles would collide in a presidential race that shocked the world. Albert Einstein and Elsa pose on a ship in October 1922 as they set off for a 6-month tour of the Far East. In Japan, huge crowds packed outside his hotel just to watch him appear on the balcony, like a science celebrity. Nurses climbed through wreckage at Farringdon Market in London on March 8, 1945, minutes after a V-2 rocket strike. The blast smashed the market at Farringdon Road and Charterhouse Street. John F. Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson watched the first United States manned spaceflight on May 5, 1961, packed into a small White House office around a television. Alan Shepard's flight lasted about 15 minutes and made America's first human leap into space. Uniformed bus conductors punch paper tickets with hand machines, smiling as they move through crowded aisles. Before digital passes, every ride depended on these simple clicks and paper stubs to track fares. While we're looking at these photos, write in the comments which pictures you like the most and why. I'm really interested in your opinion, and I'd love to read it all. Well, we continue. 2 London police officers patrol Cable Street in the 1940s, boots on wet cobbles under the foggy East End light. This street later became famous for the 1936 anti-fascist Battle of Cable Street. American troops salute as the United States flag rises over Corregidor after the island was declared recaptured on March 2, 1945. The flagpole became a symbol of return. Jewish worshippers lined the Williamsburg Bridge railing in New York City on Rosh Hashanah in 1909, praying above the East River. The photo captures the holiday's solemn start in the middle of a loud, modern city. Steeplejack Fred Dibna stands on a narrow plank at the top of a chimney above Bolton, showing the job done with ladders and nerve. He later became a British television icon for his industrial-age films, keeping old mills and steam engines alive for a new audience. A foggy Mitre Square in the City of London around 1910, with a lone figure beside a cart under towering brick walls. This small square is infamous as the scene of a Whitechapel-era killing in 1888. Wounded servicemen crowd the deck in 1944, one with a leg cast, as they scan the horizon for their first glimpse of home. The stacked life rafts and cramped railings show how a troop ship carried hundreds back across the Atlantic. A Coast Guard seaman is baptized in churning seawater inside an LST's open bow doors in the Pacific in 1945. The photo was taken just before the ship reached Iwo Jima, capturing a calm ritual on the edge of battle. 2 survivors cling to a life raft as Coast Guard sailors haul them aboard the cutter Bibb in the North Atlantic in 1943. Their transport, USS Henry R. Mallory, was sunk on the way to Iceland with heavy loss of life. A 1973 dig in Plovdiv reveals curved stone seating from a 1st-century Roman stadium hidden beneath the modern streets. The stadium once held tens of thousands for games, and parts of it are still visible in the city today. A Filipino guerrilla crouches in a ruined window holding an improvised gun during the Philippines campaign in 1941 to 1942. Cut off from supplies, many resistance fighters relied on simple pipe-built weapons that could fire a single shell with a basic slam action. Royal Welsh Fusiliers from the 53rd Welsh Division advanced through Wies, Germany on March 3, 1945, moving past shattered houses in falling snow. In the foreground, a soldier lies ready with a Piat anti-tank launcher. Vietnam veterans march in the early 1980s holding signs that read, "We'll trade useless medals for decent jobs." The protest captured a harsh reality. Many came home to unemployment, untreated trauma, and little public support. German soldiers trudged through a whiteout on the Eastern Front in 1941 to 1942, retreating after the failed push on Moscow. The winter exposed how badly the Army lacked cold weather gear and reliable transport on frozen roads. A Titanic lifeboat is lowered from the davits with crew inside during the final Board of Trade inspection on April 10, 1912. The test took about 30 minutes, and the ship was cleared to sail later that day. A firefighter battles a tanker truck blaze on the Washington Bridge in East Providence, Rhode Island, in 1963 after a fuel truck collision. The bridge shut for 5 hours at rush hour, causing what local papers called the worst traffic jam in state history. A long line of circus elephants marches through a Pennsylvania town in 1910 as crowds pack the sidewalks. The huge stone church and tight row houses make it look like a Main Street parade route. Churchill tanks and infantry of the Coldstream Guards Mass in Karavanheim, Germany, on March 3, 1945, before pushing toward Winnekendonk. 2 days earlier, The same fight there earned Private James Stokes a posthumous Victoria Cross. A woman writes a chalk message on a wall in the ruins of Berlin in 1945, using the city itself as a notice board. After the war, survivors covered walls with names and addresses, hoping family members would see them and reconnect. Men newly imprisoned at Auschwitz in 1944 are marched out after selection for forced labor. Their belongings were taken, their heads were shaved, and an identification number was tattooed on the left arm. Men point to bullet holes in the stone of Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago, scars still visible decades later. On October 11, 1926, mob-era gunfire on these steps killed Jaime Weiss and Patrick Murray in a hit widely linked to Al Capone. Sherlock Holmes claims he used Baritsu at Reichenbach Falls in 1891, but the real system was published in Britain only in 1898. That 7-year gap is one of the strangest timeline slips in the Holmes stories. Coast Guard mascot Sinbad poses in 1946, perched inside a giant ship horn like a celebrity. He spent 8 years at sea and traveled over 1 million miles with Coast Guard crews. The Oscars are staged for their first television broadcast in Los Angeles in 1953 after years as a radio-only event. That night, the ceremony jumped into living rooms and turned Hollywood's private party into mass entertainment. The Japanese ferry Toyomaru sails the Tsugaru Strait before the typhoon disaster on September 26, 1954. The sinking killed about 1,170 people and became one of Japan's worst maritime tragedies. Thai women pose in traditional dress at the Paris Exposition in 1889, photographed as part of a colonial-era human exhibition. These displays treated real people as attractions, a practice later condemned as dehumanizing. A convoy of newly built cars from the first auto assembly plant rolls through Priokskaya Street in Nizhny Novgorod in 1930, heading for Moscow. The factory later became the Gorky Bus Plant, a key name in Soviet mass transport. Cranes rise over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant under construction in the 1970s, with the reactor building taking shape behind a forest of power lines. Within a decade, it would be one of the Soviet Union's biggest power stations. Leo Tolstoy stands with patients at the Troitsk District Psychiatric Hospital, leaning in to speak face-to-face. One patient insists he is Tsar Peter the Great, and Tolstoy listens as if it is real. A 1955 photo marks the Sarajevo street corner with footprints showing where Gavrilo Princip stood on June 28, 1914. From that spot, he shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, a spark that helped ignite World War I. Soldiers crowd into a muddy trench in Volhynia as orders are read out from a dugout doorway. In this kind of front line, a few shouted words could send whole squads into action within minutes. A little girl offers flowers as Emperor Karl is welcomed by villagers in Carinthia on the southwest front. He became emperor in 1916 and soon toured front areas, trying to lift morale as the war dragged on. A patrol runs back to an Austro-Hungarian trench across a snow-covered no-man's land, with wire posts cutting the horizon. In winter, every step left a dark trail that could give away a raid from far away. A man dances in a striped prison uniform at a Georgia convict camp in May 1941, while others play guitar and clap time. These camps used forced labor on road and farm crews, and music was one of the few moments of relief. Soviet paratroopers spar with Afghan government troops during combat training on an airbase in Afghanistan in April 1988. The drills came as Soviet forces were preparing to leave, with the final withdrawal completed in February 1989. Tattooed performer Betty Broadbent poses in front of a mirror in Sydney in April 1938, showing full-body ink in sharp detail. Much of the work was done by artist Fred Harris, and her tattoos made her a headline act in sideshows and vaudeville. A lone man walks outside Bankers Trust at 14 Wall Street in New York in 1932, holding a sign demanding his lost savings of $2,950. The number on the sign is the shock because it was a fortune during the Great Depression. Women's Royal Naval Service members load sacks onto a mailboat in an English harbor in November 1944. Their job was to get letters and parcels out to ships at anchor, keeping sailors connected to home. On Brook Island in Queensland on March 3, 1944, Olive Lucas and Jack Lega checked tethered goats in a weapons pit before a classified protection trial. A giant Blohm and Voss, Ha-139, seaplane lifts off from a catapult ship in the late 1930s, built to hurl mail across the Atlantic. It carried about 500 kilograms of post and could fly roughly 5,000 kilometers from West Africa to Brazil. Towering water plumes erupt beside HMS Hood and HMS Valiant in the western Mediterranean on July 9, 1940, photographed from HMS Ark Royal. Italian SM-79 bombers dropped these near misses. A Vietnam veteran hugs a woman at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial dedication in 1982, holding a sign about stopping future wars. The memorial's black wall lists over 58,000 names, turning grief into a public place of memory. A Pennsylvania Railroad work crew digs out Homewood Avenue in Pittsburgh on August 26, 1913, to lower the rail grade. The huge trench and steam engine show how cities literally reshape streets to stop deadly train crossings. People line up at Seaboard National Bank's roving bank teller truck in Los Angeles in 1929, using a drive-up window on wheels. It brought deposits and cash service to scheduled neighborhood stops years before modern ATMs. U.S. troops of the 3rd Chemical Mortar Battalion stack 4.2-inch mortar rounds near Bitburg, Germany on March 3, 1945. The 4 Deuce teams fired heavy smoke and high explosive shells to cover infantry advances in the final push into Germany. Firefighters blast water from aerial ladders onto the Windy City restaurant at 15 West Randolph Street in Chicago in 1980. The street is packed with hoses and trucks as smoke pours from the block. Bertha Liebeck poses for a Nebraska penitentiary mugshot in 1903 with inmate number 5693 on her headboard. Newspapers said she used staged fainting to get close to wealthy men and lift wallets while they tried to help. Victorian-era strongwoman Miriam Kate Williams, known on stage as Vulcana, poses to show her powerful shoulders and arms. She toured music halls as one half of a famous strength act, challenging the era's ideas of what women could do. A smashed car and paving stones form a barricade in Paris in May 1968, with the Sorbonne Chapel rising behind it. The student revolt sparked a wave of strikes that pulled in around 10 million workers and nearly froze the country. Circus performer Miss Mara Campos trains her arms with a heavy barbell outdoors in 1958. Her act relied on real strength, and this photo catches the raw work behind the stage. Smoke blankets, Washington, District of Columbia, in 1968 as fires burned during the Unrest after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. The city saw days of damage with about 1,200 buildings burned. The Richardson brothers pose on their homemade Potomac River hydro biplane in Washington, District of Columbia in 1916, with pilot George A. Gray at the controls. It is an early do-it-yourself aircraft where businessmen in suits stand beside the open frame. Men pump water into wooden barrel carts during flood cleanup in the Netherlands in 1959, with a child watching beside the truck. The mix of horses, wagons, and a motor tanker shows how communities used every tool they had to recover. A young woman stands on a shattered street after clashes between Catholic protesters and police in Northern Ireland in August 1969. The Battle of the Bogside in Derry lasted 3 days, with barricades. Smoke hangs over besieged Port Arthur in 1905 after bombardment during the Russo-Japanese War, with the cruiser Pallada visible at left. Pallada was sunk in the harbor in December 1904, later raised by Japan, renamed Tsugaru, a Lockheed C-130. Hercules drops cargo bundles by parachute during Operation Junction City in Vietnam in 1967. It was one of the war's biggest airborne supply efforts, feeding troops deep in the jungle without a runway. South Korean recruits sit packed on a railcar platform on July 17, 1950, waiting to be sent to an army training center as the Korean War begins. The crowded stillness shows how fast the mobilization hit. A keeper counts Gibraltar's Barbary macaques in 1942, the only wild monkeys in Europe. A local legend says Britain holds Gibraltar as long as the macaques stay, and Winston Churchill ordered the troop reinforced when numbers fell. Men in northern Rhodesia pose with an enormous python skin around 1931 to 1932, stretched like a banner across the whole line. The hide hints at a snake so long it took a crowd just to hold it up. Women camp guards line up in uniform in Europe during World War II, a rarely photographed part of the camp system. After the war, some were tried for war crimes, while many blended back into civilian life and were never identified. Parisians circle an abandoned German Panther tank on the Quai des Célestins in 1944, with bicycles rolling past like it is just another street scene. The Panther was one of Germany's most feared tanks. A Japanese geisha checks her white Oshiroi makeup in a mirror while dressing in a striped kimono for an evening engagement. The white face paint was traditionally made from rice powder. 21-year-old Andre the Giant towers over the Cannes beach in 1967, lifting a smiling woman like she weighs nothing. At about 218 centimeters tall, he became one of wrestling's most famous giants and later a film star. A Project 9. 4-1. Akula ballistic missile submarine, NATO Typhoon, sits in the Severodvinsk shipyard in 1983, its bow painted with Soviet symbols. It was the largest submarine class ever built, about 175 meters long. Mountains of crates and netted bundles are hoisted aboard Titanic before sailing, packing food and linen for a full round trip. When the ship went down, most of those supplies sank too, turning everyday cargo into part of the wreck. Chinese 19th Route Army soldiers crouch behind a street barricade in Shanghai during the January 1932 fighting. Their stand slowed the Japanese advance in a brutal battle that turned city blocks into front lines. Portland's forestry building towers in logs at the Lewis and Clark Exposition in 1905, one of the world's largest log buildings ever made. It survived as a museum for decades, then burned down in August 1964. Ferenc Szalasi, leader of Hungary's Aerocross, stands on the Danube in Budapest in 1946 with the ruined chain bridge behind him. Nearby today is the shoes on the Danube Bank Memorial. Muscovites queue at a greens tent by the old Kamovniki market in the late 1920s, a normal scene in Nepi-era Moscow. People often joined lines without knowing what was being sold because any food could vanish in minutes. American and Soviet soldiers crowd together in the German village of Gribo, Saxony, in May 1945, grinning as one man plays an accordion. Jack Daniel, the Tennessee whiskey founder, reportedly kicked his office safe after he forgot the combination and hurt his toe. The injury later led to serious complications, and he passed away in 1911. A 1960s civil defense family shelter mock-up packs adults and children into narrow bunks and benches under a 7-foot ceiling. It was designed for about 13 people, turning survival planning into a cramped living room underground. North Vietnamese soldiers escort South Vietnam's leader Duong Van Minh through Saigon on April 30, 1975, hours before the war ended. That day, he went on radio to announce an unconditional surrender as the city fell. Queen Elizabeth II rides in a London carriage beside Japan's Emperor Hirohito during his state visit in 1971. The trip from Victoria Station to Buckingham Palace turned the street into a live stage of post-war diplomacy. Statue of Liberty's torch and arm stood as a full-size piece in a Paris park, looking like a giant monument all by itself. It was built early so people could see the project up close and help fund the statue before the full figure was assembled and shipped to New York. A damaged daguerreotype portrait on a polished silver plate with smears and scratches that make the face look half erased. Early cameras needed long, still poses, so tiny head moves and chemical tarnish often left these eerie double images. Adeline and Augusta Van Buren ride 2 motorcycles coast to coast in 1916, pushing through rough roads and bad weather to prove women could do military messenger work. They were even arrested for wearing riding pants, but still rolled into Los Angeles and made history. A family stands on the porch of a rough log cabin in Harlan County, Kentucky, with laundry hanging on a line and bare hillside earth around the house. This coal country county later became famous as Bloody Harlan during violent mine labor wars in the 1930s. Smokestacks and head frames loom over Butte, Montana's richest hill on earth, where copper mining ran day and night around 1909. The ore from these hills helped wire the modern world, and companies like Anaconda turned Butte into one of America's biggest boomtowns. An Australian driver gives his horse a drink at an Australian Comforts Fund stall in Longueval, France, during World War I. A 19-year-old Titanic passenger named Jeremiah Burke is often linked to a legend about a last note sealed in a bottle as the ship went down. The tale says it washed ashore about a year later near his mother's home, but the details are hard to prove. Vivian Thomas helped pioneer a life-saving heart surgery for babies and quietly trained top surgeons while standing just off camera in the operating room. He was paid like a janitor for decades, then later honored by the same medical school that relied on his hands and brain. A barefoot woman in a headscarf and shawl poses for a stark studio portrait on Sakhalin, 1903. At the time, Sakhalin was infamous as a remote Russian prison island, and writer Anton Chekhov had documented its harsh life just a decade earlier. Loretta Lynn's parents stand for a plain, no-frills portrait in rural Kentucky, the kind of photo families kept for life. Their daughter grew up in Butcher Hollow coal country and later turned that hard childhood into the hit story song Coal Miner's Daughter. Carnival strongman Frank Cannonball Richards braces as a cannon fires a heavy ball into the protective plate on his stomach. The stunt relied on a thick steel shield and rock-hard core control, and he reportedly lived into his 80s despite years of shows. In order not to miss the daily selection of historical photos, subscribe to my channel and write in the comments which shots you liked the most and why.